one of the biggest assets that we can give the parents that we work with is this skill set, this ability to regulate oneself. And part of that is actually the overwhelm and the overthinking, the rumination, the thoughts, the guilt, the anxiety, all of that that happens in the top part of our brain. We teach parents how to teach their kids these important skills, but we also teach parents these really important skills, to not get caught up. Yes, seek information and learn and grow, but also regulate yourself, regulate your emotions, calm your nervous system down, learn how to attune to yourself and your needs and how you're feeling.
Welcome to Third Culture Therapy. Today we're joined by Sara Raslan and Karen Abujaude, the insightful voices behind The Wise Parent, a parenting consultancy and popular Instagram page of the same name. As educators, parenting experts, and mothers, Sara and Karen bring a wealth of knowledge on raising confident, emotionally intelligent children in a globalized world. Their work bridges cultures and generations, offering practical wisdom for parents navigating today's unique challenges. So get ready for a conversation filled with insights, heart, and expert advice. Excited to dive in with you both, Karen and Sara. Thank you so much for joining me today on Third Culture Therapy.
Thanks so
Thank you
much
so
for
much for having
having
us. We've been looking forward to this chat.
Yeah, me too. You're both based in the UAE, in Dubai, but you come from different parts of the world and you've grown up in different places around the world. How do each of you identify yourselves?
That's such a that's a difficult question. I think for most third culture kids, adults, parents, right, Sarah? I mean, I I'll let Sarah go first. Go ahead, Sarah.
This has always been such a difficult question for me growing up because I never really knew how to answer that. I think, as most third culture people, you just never feel like you fit in. So you kind of create your own identity. For me, I grew up in a household with two Syrian parents, yet myself have never lived in Syria. So, and I grew up I spent the majority of my childhood moving from country to country. So we lived across so many different countries, across different continents, even. And all the while at home, there was this sense of you are Syrian, you are Arab, and we speak Arabic at home. And yet, the culture in which I grew up in was the opposite of that, very Western. So how I identify is really a mix. I feel like my values are very much rooted in the Middle Eastern sense, and yet the way that I live my life, and the way that I speak, a lot of times people are like, "Oh, you're Syrian? You don't sound Syrian." I'm like, "Yeah, that's because I grew up outside." So I do understand and identify with many different cultures around the world as well. So I really identify, sorry for such a long answer, but I guess like every third culture person will give you such a long-winded answer to say, I identify as a Syrian or as an Arab or as a Middle Easterner, but I also identify myself as a quite international person.
Yeah. And Karen, how about you?
Um, that answer for me changed so much over the years. I think in my youth, I didn't really know what I was. Just like Sarah, I grew up with two Lebanese parents, so two very Arab parents that were very rooted in holding on to their culture and their values as we grew up around the world. So that was ingrained at home, yet I'm mixing with cultures that have, very different values or very different ways of living. So as a child, it was more confusing. As a young adult or teen, moving to the UAE, which was a melting pot of cultures, started to feel a little bit more Middle Eastern, just because the exposure to the language and to the culture and the way that the UAE ingrains religion in their politics also brings you back to your origins. Now, as an adult, that question kind of feels easier to answer because I think both Sarah and I feel more settled in our roots as Middle Easterners. This is the culture that we are trying to instill in our kids, just like our parents were trying to instill it in ours, except we have a remixed version. So we have the traditional values, but I mean, you'll hear us say this throughout the podcast, but we have our traditional values and we mix it with modern ways of implementing it. And we're still trying to keep that, in our DNA, in our blood, in our, in the future generation that
Mm.
isn't growing up in their homeland. Sarah's kids aren't, my kids aren't, I'm not. So yeah, I think I identify as a Middle Easterner who is kind of a chameleon.
A chameleon Middle Easterner. Well, the UAE also really offers that space to be that, a chameleon in many ways.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's perhaps no surprise that you have been able to kind of embrace a bit of the fluidity while you're there, while living there, but also having that anchor, as you say, of sort of Arab Middle Eastern culture, because ultimately it is, an Arab Middle Eastern Muslim country. So it does already have in its basis, in its kind of architecture, let's
Yeah.
say, many of the elements that you already sort of resonate with. But also because it's so international and cosmopolitan, gives enough space for it to be a bit fluid, which is kind of what you've sort of described both of you as, having these, perhaps these anchors to a certain extent, but like around them you can kind of play. And I really love the way you described what you do as a sort of remixed parenting. And yes, definitely going to find out more exactly what you mean by that. But I suppose to start off with, what inspired you both to create The Wise Parent, this consultancy and social media platform offering this sort of remixed parenting style, as you call
Mm.
it?
I always introduce our story as a love story, but the more ingrained in our culture that we become, or the more mature we become, the more I realize that Sarah and I started this business because we discovered we were each other's tribe. We
Mm,
were each other's support system in a time when it was really difficult. So we had met before we had kids. We were pregnant around the same time, delivered around the same time, up at 4 a.m., breastfeeding and messaging at the same time. And at that time, we were nerding out, geeking out together with all this information on child development, brain, neuroscience, everything that was really nerdy that we both love. And we were each other's support system. And from that knowledge and that support, there was a nice intersection where they kind of merged together, and we were supporting and exchanging information. And then we started becoming that resource for our friends and community. And that's how it was born. When we had our kids, we were looking for information that could help us, but nothing connected with us culturally. So we were
mm,
trying to find something that was a mix of what that remix that we're talking about. There's so many Western parenting pages, but nothing connected with our culture, our history. And so we were kind of looking for more answers that understood our parents' trauma, or how we were parented, or the culture and the values that ensured our families, let's say, survival at the time. So, long story short, knowledge, support, tribe, and um, cultural values was what we were looking for. And so from that was the birth of the Wise Parents.
you're talking about this knowledge gap, but Karen, you have a background in early childhood and family development. And Sarah, as well, you have a background, an academic background in neuroscience and psychology. So you do both come with already a wealth of knowledge in this particular field, childhood development, psychology. But you both seem to have found there were gaps in that.
There were lots of gaps, I think, in Sarah, I know you have a lot of opinions about this, but when we were studying what we were studying, there was so much research done in the Western world or the European world, and it's really hard to find information and data on Eastern cultures. Or specifically, when we were looking for our own research in our higher level degrees, we were looking for Middle Eastern information. And that's really hard to find. And because of that, the approaches or the techniques or whatever it may be, when it's applied into the daily life of parents or when you're applying it to modern day psychology, you can understand it, but sometimes it's not so relatable because there's a big cultural aspect that's missing.
Yeah.
And so and because of this, Sarah is completely inspired to do something so brilliant. She's trying to develop a trauma informed program that is specific to this region. For me, because of when I was doing my degree, my initial reason for entering this degree was how do I safeguard this future generation from the inherited like second generation trauma? How do we protect ourselves from this so that our kids aren't doing therapy for the same reasons we are? And there are gaps. And so we our degrees help us a lot, and we're still studying this market and how parents are impacted, and we're still studying clients from this region and how we can support them.
Why is there such gap in knowledge and information specific to this region?
I think the majority of research is coming from the Western world. Let's just be frank about that. Let's just say what it is, you know? So with that, a lot of the explorations in child development and parent-child relationships, and how those relationships impact the future of this child really do come from Western models and therefore Western culture. The gaps that we're seeing is that when it comes to the parenting world, a lot of the expertise that's out there, the parenting experts, and I want to say that most parents, they kind of consume their information on social media and online. So a lot of the parenting experts that are online are coming from a Western background. And so when they suggest things on parenting approaches, or when they suggest things on how certain parenting responses impact a child's development, it is very much from a Western lens. And I'm just going to use an example just to make this make a little bit more sense. In the Western sense, boundaries and independence is very much part of Western culture and values. In Eastern culture and values, interdependence is more prominent and more important. And so if we start to apply Western values of how to set boundaries in an Eastern culture, then there's kind of like a disjointment that happens. There's a disconnect there. The perceptions of respect and obedience in an Eastern culture is very different than in a Western culture. And why that matters in terms of parenting and child development is that the brain actually wires and develops based on certain perceptions and the way that a child kind of perceives its world. So in Eastern cultures like ourselves, we tend to overemphasize certain aspects, and that doesn't necessarily translate in a negative way in the way that it does in the West. And so basically for us, when we form the wise parent and the way that we kind of position ourselves with our clients is that we are very much attuned to these cultural nuances. And we don't disregard that in our approach to how we are communicating and how we are advising our parents with their children.
Have you heard of the silk hair wrap company Paradise Fold? I've been using their 100% silk double-layered reversible wraps and turbans for years. And if you love your hair, I think you're really going to love these too. Beautifully designed, snug and luxurious, they're the ticket to hydrated, healthy, frizz-free hair. Third Culture Therapy podcast listeners get a special 10% discount on the Paradise Fold website with the code TCT10. Where does the word wise fit into this? Like, why have you chosen that word? What does wisdom in this context mean to you?
When I think about this, the first thought I had was I remember something my dad told me. He says, you have to know that as much as you know nothing. And
Mm,
everything and all the wealth of knowledge in this world, no matter how much you study and learn, it's microscopic in the grand scheme of things. So wisdom isn't about that you know nothing, but for us, it's that you're forever going to be in a state of learning, in a state of curiosity. And, calling it the wise parent, it's about what you want to become in your process of learning. Learning not just from the information you consume, but from your partner, from your kids, from your tribe. There's so much for you to learn and to become wiser.
so it's kind of aspirational in a way. Yeah.
It's definitely aspirational, and in my mind, it was always a response to the past generations' mode of parenting, which is very top down. It's very
Mm-hmm.
much like, I'm the parent, I'm the authority, I know what's best, do what you're told, don't ask questions. And today, what we're trying to kind of convey through the wise parent is that the wisdom is in also accepting that we are unfinished products. We
Mm-hmm.
also have our own work to do. And so we don't want to assume that just because we're parents that we know it all. Especially when it comes to our children. And kids actually pick up on that, especially as they get older. I'm sure you remember, I
Yeah.
feel like every single person has that light bulb moment where they remember or where they suddenly realize that their parents are not gods, that their parents are imperfect. I have a very specific moment where I looked at my parent and I was like, oh my God, you can make mistakes.
Mm.
And so today with parenting, it is very much an acknowledgement that I'm also learning and I'm also seeking that wisdom, seeking that knowledge, and always wanting to improve myself for me and for you, the child, my family.
To play devil's advocate a little bit, I also would imagine there's a sense, the potential of overwhelm in that, you know, anything is possible, all roads are open, and learn, continue to strive to learn and improve and better yourself. How do you
Mm.
balance that sort of tension between, wanting to offer wisdom to parents without being either overly prescriptive, but also not overwhelming them with the infinite possibilities of choice and of mistakes?
That's so difficult, Leila. It's so difficult nowadays because it's not just with parenting, it's with everything. We have access to so much information that
Hmm.
it's I don't want to say it's impossible, but it requires an active effort to not spiral into, the overwhelm, the stress, the guilt, um, of not being good enough, not doing it all. Yeah, one of the biggest assets that we can give the parents that we work with is this skill set, this ability to regulate oneself. And part of that is actually the overwhelm and the overthinking, the rumination, the thoughts, the guilt, the anxiety, all of that happens in the top part of our brain. Emotion regulation is basically when these emotions kind of hijack everything, and we require kind of like a cognitive conscious effort to soothe that part of the brain and to regulate our nervous system. So what I would say to your, how I would answer your question, Leila, is um, we teach parents how to teach their kids these important skills, but we also teach parents these really important skills, to not get caught up. Yes, seek information and learn and grow, but also regulate yourself, regulate your emotions, calm your nervous system down, learn how to attune to yourself and your needs and how you're feeling, and learn how to calm those with certain coping strategies or coping skills that we teach and promote. So yeah, I think that in this world of so much information and everything is at a very high pace, to learn how to slow the mind down, and regulate our emotions.
I was also going to say it's important to, we have this concept of, is for when we work with kids, is it developmentally appropriate or is it at the right stage of their development? the same kind of applies to adults. We have to meet each person where they're at. So if we're working with someone who is, let's say, extremely informed about, let's say modern methodologies in parenting, they can probably do step 5 in regulating themselves. And we've worked with clients that can only do step 0.5 in regulating themselves. So it's really about understanding and attuning to yourself and your capacity and avoiding this comparison of where you should be. That's also ingrained in the word wisdom, is understanding your own capacity and your level without comparing to anybody else.
It's a beautiful universal principle, that, and a very wise one. This idea of meeting people where they are, and letting go of comparisons and accepting kind of your own journey. I think that applies to every facet of life. These universal principles definitely run through, obviously, your philosophy in parenting, but part of your USP is the cultural awareness and the diversity that each culture, different cultures bring, maybe in their approaches. How do you balance those two things? Universal elements, love, acceptance, compassion, but then you're bringing in these influences, these different approaches culturally.
There are certain universalities when it comes to parenting and the approach to children. All children, all humans require connection. We all have this existential need to feel like I matter, I exist, I'm heard, I'm seen, I'm loved. These are universal. And so when it comes to parenting, there are certain things that we believe are paramount, like connection, like setting boundaries, because children also require healthy boundaries. And I don't mean boundaries in the sense of like I need my space, like I need my, like in in the kind of like individualistic sense. But for children, they need boundaries because they need to have rules around the way, where the space that they can operate in a safe way. And so with those two things, we teach them universally. But understanding the nuances of the parent themselves and how they are impacted by their children, that is where the difference comes in. Because as Karen said, each person has their own experiences, their own baggage, their own culture, their own whatever it is. And that comes into play in how they're parenting. So what I mean by that is, for one household or for one parent, a nagging child is super triggering, perhaps because they were not allowed to nag when they were children. Because nagging is fundamentally at the base, it's a display of expression of wants. So when we nag for children, it's because they don't know how to express themselves in a different or more coherent way, and so they nag to express that they want or need something. So perhaps in the background of that parent or their childhood or their culture, having too many wants is not allowed or is not accepted. Perhaps in a community or in a culture where interdependence is very highly valued, then an individual need cannot supersede the collective or the family. And so that parent, if they grew up in that kind of culture, in an Eastern culture, then they would have learned that. Now, let's say this parent now moves into a Western culture and is now a third culture parent, where Western culture, prioritizes, elevates individuality and do express yourself, express what you want and need. You are safe to do so. It's important for you to do so. And so the child now grows up in a culture where they're very much telling their parent, I want this and I need this and no. And that's triggering for a parent because they would have grown up in a different background. And so when we parent, we do understand that. And it's just about bringing that to light.
Hey, are you enjoying this episode? Well, let us know. In fact, better yet, let others know by sharing the show with them. Follow Third Culture Therapy Pod on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack, and listen to the show on all the usual channels. Now, where were we? What do you think then? You've already touched on this, but some of the unique challenges those parents who are growing up children in third cultures are facing today.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges um, when you're growing up, when you are a third culture parent and you're holding on to that, is the biggest challenge is losing those values. And then there's such a difference in your child when they integrate with your family of origin.
Mm,
There's a big there's a big noticeable difference when when we hear the third culture parent talking about how the grandparent perceives their parenting style or their child. So
mm.
that's a huge challenge for third culture parents.
This third culture parent is like this incubator
Hmm.
between worlds,
Yeah,
trying as well to come up with a new formula. So already this is a challenge, right? Because it's new, it's
yeah,
oftentimes unique. Then they're like, right, we're gonna try and do this, and then they're getting, instead of like support, they're getting judgment
yes.
um, about that, and yeah, it's very difficult, right? It's family, and
Hmm.
like all the
Hmm.
therapy in the world will not help you really. I mean, it will help you to a certain degree, but it will not shield you from the impact of parental familial judgment. You will
100%.
feel it, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense. And how would you as consultants, as coaches in this field, how would you help a parent in that situation? Because obviously it's complex, and going back to your earlier point of, it's not about putting up necessarily these harsh boundaries, because culturally, at least within, we'll talk a bit more the Arab Eastern culture, um, that's not really, that's not only not the done thing, but it's not the desired result either. What are some of the tools that you give them?
Sarah, actually, remember when you wrote out like a step-by-step guide about how to so I remember this because it's such a difficult one, Layla. It's a difficult one because you still need to honor and respect your parents, and at the same time you're trying to reprogram your system so that you are improving upon the next generation. So you're a translator between the old and the new, and sometimes it glitches. The essence of all of this is rooted in a very important value, one of Sarah and I's favorite value, which is respect.
Mm,
Respect for the family, for yourself, and for your process, your new process. So it's a very delicate dance. There are ways, depending on the involvement of, the external family, there are ways to invite cooperation. There are ways to ask and align with your family. When you invite someone into your world and you're giving that family, your parents, your in-laws, the benefit of the doubt of maybe exploring something with you. From there,
yeah,
you can gauge someone's interest. Are they open-minded or are they really closed off? If they're really closed off, you're not putting up a wall, but maybe there's certain limitation to what is exposed to them, how often you quote unquote discipline, or how you discipline, or then you adapt. But you're going to invite them into your world, and then you gauge how much can you teach them, how much can you expose to them, and you align on your larger objectives for this child. You want them to be X, Y, Z. What are these values? And of course, your family's not going to be like, no, I don't want those things for them. They're going to want those things. But you also have to remember that this is a whole new language for that generation. It's
yeah,
Chinese to them. They grew up
mm,
in a survival mode, surviving, grinding, no time for emotions. The space that we are living in now, it's very different. And we can still respect our process. That doesn't mean
mm,
we dismiss what we are trying to do. It means we also have to honor our new approach. We have to honor the difficulty in rewiring those those,
Mm,
the brain that we have built from that generation, because we are fixing this and we are like molding that, in our
yeah.
kids. So it's like a that job of like, and you have to manage your expectations and your emotions. It's a very delicate dance, but it's all
Mm,
rooted in respect. And once you're rooted in respect for them, you and your kid, it feels a little bit more fluid.
yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Besides the intergenerational challenges that we've just discussed, what are some of the other common issues that parents come to you with? And do you notice any particular themes based on particular backgrounds and cultures?
The biggest challenge that the majority of parents, honestly, wherever they're coming from, all over the world, it's triggers. That's their number one thing. Um, it's their own triggers. So I think that there's this misunderstanding that parents think that, getting support from a parent coach is all about giving them the techniques and strategies to fix, and I'm putting air quotes, their child. But what we realize, and what parents very quickly realize, is that it's less about their child and more about them and the way that they're interpreting and perceiving their children. And
Mm,
so one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest transformations is when they are able to look internally and heal that first. Because when that is worked on, and there's a really famous book by Dr. Dan Siegel called Parenting Inside Out, and it's very well understood that if we want to improve our parenting, then we have to work on ourselves first. It is the parent first. We are that first line. So that's one of the biggest things is the triggers. Why am I getting so triggered by my kid? And the guilt that comes with it, because as we said at the beginning of this conversation, with all of this wealth of information, we are now hyper aware of the impact that we could have on our child's brain and their well-being and their development. And so with that comes this like immense guilt and fear of like, am I messing up my kid? When I lose it, I'm losing on my kid all the time. I'm shouting at them. I'm threatening them. I'm punishing them. I don't want to do this, but I can't get out of this loop. Help. That's usually the number one thing that parents come to us with.
how does that differ or to going to therapy?
Um, Great question. So the difference is that we we don't therapize so much, if that's even a word. We do like to kind of explore a little bit the background and the history of the parent, but we don't dwell on that. We won't spend months and years kind of intellectualizing the whys behind
Mm,
certain things, because the why question is infinite. The difference with us as coaches is that we give very practical tools. Like, okay, so what next is what we're trying to answer. What do I do with this? How do I change this cycle? How do I change this pattern? How do I get into a new habit? How do I rewire my brain so that I respond differently to my children?
Our metaphor for that is like we are parenting personal trainers. So we go to the gym with you and we do the exercises with you. And it's about building that, I guess the stronger muscles in practice. So it's practice, 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 accountability, bringing you back to that accountability.
what sort of tools are in the box for parents?
Essentially, there are two types of tools that you use in the heat of a moment. And our favorite is tools that you use outside of the moment. So
Mm,
outside of the moment tools are probably the most important because they're your rehearsal, your dress rehearsal for the main show, which is inside the moment.
One of the most powerful ways is a visualization. So, where that's different to meditation, meditation is about sitting and kind of clearing your mind. Visualization is the opposite of that. So it's about visualizing certain triggering moments that could come up
mm,
and rehearsing those in your mind. And the beauty of that is that your subconscious, when you're when you're closing your eyes and you're visualizing with as much detail, I'm talking 4 HD, color, sound, texture, feeling, smell, whatever it is, the more detail you add, the more that your brain is actually going to believe that this is real. And this is your opportunity to practice the breathing and the pausing and all of these fancy kind of regulation techniques that, I'm sure everyone is aware of. So you can't do them in the moment if you haven't rehearsed them. So if you visualize yourself doing one of these things, and it has to be baby steps. We are so often quick to go from 0 to 100. Like, I'm going to become a Buddha, okay? And these most triggering, high intense moments, I'm going to become this person that doesn't react and says the right thing at the right time, mic drop. No. When you're visualizing, you need to, be realistic and give yourself a bit of like compassion at like the steps and the progress to then getting to closer to the type of response or the type of reaction to triggering moments. So for me, if nagging is a really big trigger and my usual response is to explode and to shout and to scream and to shut down my kid, then I'm going to visualize triggering moments where I'm going to picture my kid nagging. I'm going to hear that high pitched sound and the repetition. And then I'm going to visualize myself maybe taking a deep breath. And that's it. That's it. That's step number one. And then with each time that I visualize that and I can see myself actually being able to do that in real life, then I can add to it and build on my coping skills.
I'm curious to delve into a little bit, culturally speaking, and the cultural norms, values, traditions, and whether you have faced or you continue to see the challenge and the tension, let's say, between parents who may perhaps have certain values and cultural traditions and maybe living in a place that doesn't necessarily hold the same or to the same degree, and the conflict they may be facing internally but also externally on how to pass on that or not, as the case may be. There are some, really depending obviously on the style, some parents will completely decide, no, I don't want anything to do with the background, I'm fully immersed in the culture I'm in. Others take it very other way, I want to be completely as if I am back home, wherever back home is, but I'm just transplanted physically in a different place. And then there are all the variations in between. What advice can you offer parents in that scenario? It's a really difficult place to be. There's a lot of emotionality, obviously, around that, as well as your own conviction that this is the right way. What do you do when you face situations like that?
And this is kind of coming full circle on how we started this. When you asked us, how do we identify ourselves? And we answered with a lot of fluidity, right? We understand the roots, we understand the cultures of which we grew up in, and we're kind of flexible and fluid in that. And in that same way, we always, a concept of mental strength and emotional strength is being flexible, is allowing ourselves to be fluid and not being so rigid. And I would say that even when it comes to culture, growing up with a different cultural background than the one that you're living in, we like to recommend to come back to the values that you want to uphold, and don't get so stuck in how those values were taught in your culture of origin, but rather think about how you want to carry on and embody those values as you take your culture forward, right? And that's where we want to bring in that flexibility. So respect is really important for you. Great. Respect is a universal value. Perhaps respect was taught in a very different way in your culture of origin than how it's taught and understood today in the current culture or in a modern sense. And so we always like to come back and root our clients and parents into, what are your values? Actually write them down. And it really becomes such a nice conversation when we're having uh, conversations with our own parents and previous generations where they don't agree with our parenting. Well, let's talk. We agree on these universal values, right? We agree on respect. Respect is important. And how are we embodying those values? And how are we enforcing these? And how is our child going to understand them? So it might look different from a cultural perspective, but as long as those values are preserved, and that's ultimately where we can find that balance.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of thinking of it, and very rooted in something that that translates across borders, values, and
Yeah.
having that as your sort of guiding, yeah, your guiding beacon. That makes a lot of sense.
So storytelling is a big parenting strategy apart from trying to ingrain your culture. Stories are very powerful for younger kids because essentially what you're trying to do is create relatability with something else. One method to ingrain and infuse your culture is to share stories about your culture and about your history and your family with your kids. I know that was one way that bound me to a lot of values like honor and loyalty, like very deep ones, because a child wants to belong to their family as well. So you're connecting that sense of belonging to their origin. So that'll sound something like, let's say, did I ever tell you about how your grandfather helped his neighbor bring in his harvest for the season? Something that's super important in our family is community, respect, being helpful, being honorable, and supporting others. And then you can go into the story and you can make it as beautiful and as childish as you like as you like. Another way is to model it. For example, this is Sarah's favorite story. She took a picture of a shopping cart in the middle of a parking spot. And she's like, where have our values gone? Like this is unacceptable behavior. Like this is not conducive uh to communal,
Living.
upkeep.
Yeah.
And the opposite story I had was my grandma in Lebanon. She collects the trash off the street so that the street is nice and tidy because it's for the community, right? So
Wow.
when Sarah saw this, she took a picture. And one way to model your culture is by taking that cart back and explaining the purpose of why you are returning the cart. It is
Mm,
important to respect our community. It is important to be respectful to our neighbors. We have to work together to make sure that, you know, that we preserve this place or that we respect or keep it clean. My grandma, for example, when she would tidy up the street, we would go with her so she's not alone. So then it becomes ingrained. I took my daughter, for example, to do the same because I want her to be exposed to what it's like.
yeah.
Modeling that behavior and narrating it is another
Mm,
very powerful way. It's another parenting technique to infuse your culture. Rather than just taking the
mm,
cart and putting it away, you can actually explain the
yeah.
reason behind it.
Mm,
So those are two of our favorite ways to infuse and ingrain culture in a very natural way.
yeah. I love those examples, and I think your last one in particular really feeds into this idea that you talk about of parenting being more authoritative rather than authoritarian. So with the storytelling and with the modeling, you are putting yourself out as a voice of authority because I come from a lineage that does it. I come from a background, a history that does it, and I am also doing it, and I'll explain to you why I'm doing it, not go do it. And this is
Yes.
something I see often in, I feel, I mean, I don't want not to denigrate it, but I do see it a lot around in the Middle East, this sense of like people telling people, others, especially their children, what to do, but they're not doing it themselves.
Yeah.
Like, and I think, well, how would you ever expect that the child is going to
Hmm.
actually do something different than what they've seen you do just because you said it?
Yeah. We have to remember that they are watching us, and it is a very strong and powerful tool. And so
Mm,
when you also, it's on the flip side. So when you wonder, where did my child learn this from? We always ask our clients, well, do you do this at home? or does someone at home do this? It's very
Yeah.
important.
So if parents, as you said, Leila, if they're saying one thing and doing another, that contradiction is very confusing for a child, and they will grow up making their own assessments. And this is why there's sometimes like a backlash against culture of like, because it was done either in a contradictory or hypocritical way or in a harsh way, and so children grow up just kind of being like, I don't want anything to do with that anymore because of that bad experience. And so we need to be very careful as we are raising this new generation to preserve these values, and to really live, and I say this all the time, to live in alignment with our values.
We touched briefly on trauma's impact, generational, and what that might bring into parenting of the kids. The reality today, 2025, is that there are a lot of traumatic and traumatizing events happening all around us, very specifically in the region that you are living in. And what can you offer by way of advice to parents who come from these places and who are bringing, knowingly or unknowingly, these traumas into their day-to-day lives and interactions with their children? What can they do to mitigate?
We've actually had the honor of working with two sides of the spectrum of people who have been displaced. People who have been displaced not by choice and people who have moved by choice. Very different backgrounds, very different mindset, very different level of education. Because we've worked with both ends of the spectrum, there's one thing in common is that the awareness that the trauma exists.
Mm,
When you have the awareness that you need help, just that awareness of you needing help versus people who parent thinking they're doing it completely right. Like, this is my way, I'm parent. There are many like that as well.
mm,
But the awareness that I need help and support is a huge factor. Now, the way that we would advise one parent versus the other is very, very different simply because of the weight of the bags that they carry with them. When and if you can, get the support that you need. When you can get the support you need, the family system changes. And on the
mm,
other side, there's a big part of what needs to happen from, the NGO side, from the government side, from every other aspect, is there needs to be more access to support for parents who have suffered this trauma.
I want to give like this kind of like magical answer. I'm gonna give a brain answer actually, because it's fresh on my mind from this morning. Um, People that are coming from traumatic experiences in whatever shape or form, the way that their brains have wired those experiences is different from individuals that have not gone through traumatic experiences. And it is very, it's not impossible, but it requires active effort to rewire again that brain, to heal from those experiences. And the first step to that is actually knowing your own brain.
mm,
I'm going to make that make sense a little bit more. When parents teach their children about their brain, and that when they're screaming or when they're having tantrums or meltdowns or crying, they are in a certain part of the brain, and they're in their emotional or fight or flight part of the brain. Just that awareness is so powerful for children because they can start to identify and detach themselves from those emotions and those experiences. It's not, I am upset, I am
mm,
feeling upset. And to separate yourself from that is so powerful. And so I would say that even as adults, as parents, when they are going through difficult experiences in their life, if they are dysregulated and they kind of get into these overwhelmed or anxious, nervous, fearful states, it is so powerful to just have that first step of awareness of, I am feeling this way, but that is not all of who I am. That separation means that I can actually look at that and be like, okay, this is how I'm feeling, and I can get through this. I
Yeah.
can get through this.
I think you really hit the nail on the head, both of you, when you really spotlighted the awareness element, because um, like how many people are actually not even aware, right? That their actions, certain reactions, are trauma responses. I'm sure there must be times when parents are coming to you with things, thinking their reaction is just normal, like it's just par for the course. Like, this is, of course, I'm going to get very annoyed and frustrated and yell and get angry. Like, obviously.
There was a parent that we worked with a while back who used to get really triggered by her kid being joyful and silly and playful. So playfulness, which is, considered a positive emotion, to be able to play and to be curious and joyful, that was very triggering for the parent. And the parent, used to say like, oh, but this is not the time to be playful and silly. This is the time to be serious. It's time to sit down for dinner. And so it could be a trauma response, but I don't like to throw around the word trauma response so lightly, because it could also just be the nuance of that parent's experiences in their childhood. So it doesn't always have to be a trauma related
Yeah.
incident for them to perceive it, because again, since we're talking about culture, perhaps culture, the norm was that at this time, when the parent says it's time to stop playing and sit down at dinner, this is what you are meant to do, to not
Mm,
disrupt again the harmony of the household and the authority of the parent and obedience and whatnot. So again, it's so complex, Leila. Like, there's obviously
yeah.
there's trauma responses, and then there's all of the grayness in the middle, which the culture and your childhood experiences and your environment and your genetic makeup. um, so we've got
Yeah.
like a basket full of things to
Good.
to pick
Thank
away at. Or we can kind of shove that all and just be like, all right, you know what? It is what it is. I went through some stuff, and I'm going to look forward now. And what we like to do is to really support parents with just very practical tools and skills, which is why Karen and I were talking about awareness. Let's bring awareness to ourselves. How am I feeling? Where in my brain am I at? Okay, I'm in the emotional brain. I need to be up here. How do I connect my cognitive brain with my emotional brain? And how do I, respond to these situations? And let's move forward. Let's be positive and see some real changes and transformations.
You mentioned culture, and I kind of want to end on that, specifically related to the both of you. What elements of your culture do you put into your parenting basket now, and what of them have you had to take out?
Great question. The elements that we have put in, I think it's a huge amount actually. And it ranges from food, language, to values. The thing that we have changed is the way in which we implement them. So it's not my way or the highway. It's I am an authority in this house and I understand you. It's not
Mm,
you don't have a voice. It's you definitely have a voice. At the end of the day, when it comes to health and safety, it's my decision here. But yes, of course, you get choices. It's not no time for feelings, cut the BS and just get on with your life. It's yeah, it's okay to feel that way. And what is the skill that I need to teach you here? I need to
mm,
teach you a big skill. So it's the implementation that's, I would say, wildly different.
yeah.
Um, but the values are still there. Like we still hold on so much to respect, honor, community. For example, respecting your elders, acknowledging others, saying hello, never going somewhere to someone's house empty-handed, always asking or considering, an older person walking around if they need support.
Yeah, I like what Karen said. So something in our culture is that was taught to me is that the parents' word is the final word. And there wasn't much kind of space to express or to protest it, you kind of just have to nod your head and agree and don't ask why or what, just, so I don't want that anymore. Um, I don't want to maintain that with my kids. I do believe that speaking respectfully is universal. It goes both ways. So I will not accept my children to speak disrespectfully to me. I will not accept them to speak disrespectfully to each other or to others, in the same way that I will not speak disrespectfully. I like to see beneath a child's behavior, to separate the behavior from the child, because there is a full range of emotions and experiences that are going on underneath those behaviors. And so yeah, so we always have these conversations, and you know what it looks like for the older generation? It looks like we're spoiling them. It looks like we're giving them too much, free range to act out. But in reality, the way that I perceive it, at least, is that it's not at all that. It's actually, we are within a certain boundary. Certain behaviors are not allowed, but I still want to understand what's going on with you.
Yeah.
Why did you hit your sister? Oh, it's because she took your toy and you really wanted to play with that. Okay, well, it's not allowed to hit, but but you are feeling frustrated. So let's work on that frustration. How can we better cope with that emotion? And this is what we mean by coping skills: is how are we going to help you learn how to handle that feeling when it comes up with you for you? And our previous generation, I don't know if this is a cultural thing or a generational thing, but previous generations would have not necessarily distinguished the two.
Yeah.
And so you would shut down the behavior, but there's never a dialogue around the emotion that drove that behavior. And if we, and this is kind of coming back again full circle with this existential right, or need that every human has, whereas I need to feel like I exist and like I matter. And so when we shut down our kids' behavior, we are also shutting out that part of them that's like, yeah, but I wanted to play with that toy. Why does no one get me? This is unfair. Why don't my parents get me?
You hold yourself to the same standard as your child. So
Yeah.
if they're not
Mm.
allowed to lose their cool on you, you're not allowed to lose their. And it actually was not modeled to us at all as kids. As
Mm-hmm.
kids, what was modeled to us was, when I'm angry, I'm going to raise my voice, make my body big, or this intimidation. But we had no idea what what to do instead. We were modeled something for when something comes up. And now what you're saying is, hold yourself to the same standard, because at the end of the day, you're modeling that to your kid. And
Yeah.
I love that you said that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I think the way you kind of encapsulated it all, yes, there are a lot of different ways to get maybe to the different result. Some of them, the differences are cultural, some might be generational, but fundamentally, your point to you matter, and let me find out, let
Mhm.
me explore that more, kind of entering your space, with that, in a way, also humility. I think there's a humility to the parenting, that style of parenting approach, which it seems very much more engaging and welcoming for both parent and child. So thank you so much for sharing your tips and your insights, your expertise, and for the work that you do. It's really very fundamentally important work for everyone in living today and future generations. So thank you so much for all that you do and for your time here today on Third Culture Therapy. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners will have too.
Thank you, Leila.
Thank
It's
you
been an
so
honor,
much,
honestly.
Leila.
And the work that you're doing too is also super important. The fact that you're bringing up this concept of third culture, um, is so powerful. I think that third culture is missing in a lot of the therapy dialogue. So thank you for your work.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, I think you guys might be called fourth culture now, because your third raising third cultures. Is it like third squared?
Third twice removed.
Oh God. You guys are going to have a lot of work in your future. Thank you for listening to this episode of Third Culture Therapy. We'd love to hear from you, so get in touch with us via Instagram or leave comments on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you are listening. And please do like, follow, and share.